For this first meeting, we're thrilled to have three wonderful presenters addressing what is probably one of the most pressing issues in our democracy that we currently face. But before we start, I'd like you to know that this meeting is being recorded and will be available on our Facebook page, maybe the League of Women Vote Connecticut page, and on YouTube. Only our presenters will be able to speak. Everyone else will be muted. During the meeting, I can unmute some League of Women Voter members who have prepared questions to ask. So without further ado, I would like to thank you so very much and to welcome our esteemed presenters. Cindy Ladwig, Town Clerk in Stonington, Christine Connolly, State Representative for Groton and Ledyard, part of Groton and Ledyard, and Denise Merrill, our Secretary of State, who has been working very hard all day on a million Zoom meetings, I am sure. So Denise, would you like to start?
Sure, and thank you guys so much, first of all. I know you have been powerful and consistent allies on so many issues around voting in the last couple of years, and this is no exception. So I'll try to be brief, although it's a very complicated situation. I know that the League nationally has taken a position to support the availability of absentee ballots or voting by mail or whatever you want to call it at this point, especially during this pandemic. And as I keep saying, and the governor keeps saying, and everyone who's involved says, no one should have to choose between their health and their vote. That's the bottom line. We in Connecticut are in an especially complicated situation. We are now the only state that embodies the restrictions on absentee balloting in our state constitution. Very difficult to change. Even the governor cannot override the state constitution. As you all know, for many years I've been trying to change this, but so far it is still in place. And here we come to a situation where you need flexibility and we just don't have it. New York is the only other state that has a state constitutional provision like that. As I understand it, the other day, their governor just simply overrode it, and I don't know what will come of all that, but that is not what I'm asking our governor to do. He and I are definitely on the same page. He is horrified by the idea that people would have to literally overcome his executive order to socially distance and stay in groups of less than 5 and all that in order to vote. But that is the case. And so the primary, as you know, has been moved to August 11th for exactly that reason. I think it was a very wise move because we were in no way going to be ready for what I anticipate will be a whole increase in the number of people asking for absentee ballots, irrespective of if any of us do anything. I just think it's going to happen. So where we are with all this is that everyone wants to move ahead to the general election, and I understand that. But the governor can only govern by executive order for a very limited period of time, and I respect that. I don't think it's ideal to be governing, even in this situation, through executive order. However, there is a statute here in play which even further limits the way you can get absentee ballots. And that's the heart of my request to him, to change the statute in some way so at least we would have as much flexibility as the Constitution gives us. So to be specific, the state constitution says you can get an absentee ballot if you are unable to get to the polls due to sickness. That's all it says. But there are 2 things that it says. Remember that. It's not just about being sick. It's about being unable to get to the polls. It has never been interpreted as far as we know. It's been there, since 1818. And then we have a statute that has some further limitations in a way. And we don't really know why that happened or when it happened at this point. But what it says in the statute, which can be overridden, is that you can get an absentee ballot if you're unable to get to the polls due to his or her sickness. So you can see that in a way it limits it even further because it has to be your own sickness. So the problem we have is that you might be sick in this case and not even know it, for example. You might be afraid of being sick because you have some other underlying health condition, and so forth and so on. So the real question is, how can we provide the maximum opportunity for people to vote in the primary without running into those limitations? And nothing has caused more concern or consternation in a long time than I can remember than this issue. People are very upset. They don't want to have to be forced to make that choice. So that's the heart of the matter. Add to that the fact that in Connecticut, we're not really set up to do a great deal more absentee balloting. On most years, we get about 5 to 8% is my understanding of people who request absentee ballots, mostly because they're out of town. And so our system is not set up in a way that would easily administer a lot more. We can make some accommodations for that, and that's what we're trying to do right now. So what I'm doing in the midst of all this, besides asking the governor to sign an executive order to take that limitation out of the statute, is I'm coming up with a plan, and I'm able to do that because the Congress, allocated $400 million to the states to help them specifically accommodate vote by mail in this election. And so our amount is 5.2 million, I think it is, something like that. And so I'm going to dedicate that to two things. One will be securing the polling places, because even though we're anticipating more people might vote by mail, we also have to prepare to make the polling places safe. And the big issues there are, number one, poll workers don't want to work the polls this year. They are also, by and large, more elderly. They tend to be over the age of 60, been doing it for years. And we've known this is a kind of a crisis in my world for many years, actually. And so we have to find a way to find a new generation of poll workers. And we do have money to pay people out of the federal grant, so that might help, but we have to do something about that. And we have to secure the polling places and make people understand that they will be safe if they go to vote in person. And that's a tall order. This will basically devolve to the towns to figure out, but we hope we can help. We have money to pay for extra help in the clerk's offices, which they are going to need if there's more absentee balloting. We have money to purchase protective equipment for both poll workers and to some extent to voters coming in. We have a lot of other ideas on how we can be helpful, and we will ask towns to present plans on what their plan is for their town, because ultimately it's a local issue because elections are administered locally. So we hope what we will do will be value added to those local election officials who are going to try to manage all this. We cannot know for sure what's going to happen. You have a primary where it's predetermined, really, on both sides of the aisle. There is no chance at this point, I don't think, that we will not have a primary. People keep asking that. Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, and Rocky De La Fuente have all told us in person, in writing, that they want to remain on the ballot. And under our law, when I placed them on the ballot in February, that deadline passed. And there's really not a way to change that. So assuming we go forward, our job is to try to figure out who's going to show up, how many people are going to ask for absentee ballots versus how many people are going to show up at polling places, and how to manage that. You saw a great example of how it went very, very wrong in Milwaukee, because they assumed that everybody would get an absentee ballot, closed huge numbers of polling places, and ended up with, quite frankly, quite a disaster. So that's what we want to avoid in Connecticut. We're working very hard to make that happen. But I hope people would advocate for an executive order from the governor, loosening the requirements somewhat, and also some legislative action, because the legislature can go in and make a more permanent change to that statute and could put in something about in a pandemic, the rules are different, or they could change it in a number of ways that I think would be effective to at least help give people guidance on whether they can get an absentee ballot. So how about I stop there? I know that's really a mouthful, but that's what I've been living for about a month now. And so I'm happy to answer any questions or whatever you'd like. So thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions on that, and then we'll go on to the next speaker. So could you put your name in the chat if you have a question? Uh-oh, whoever just put on their audio. It's making that squeal sound. I don't think anybody could actually. Okay, question. What is the timeline to manage all this?
Well, you have to back up from election day. So right now, the statewide primary and the presidential preference primary are on August 11th. We have to have time for overseas ballots, and they need to be ready by 45 days in advance. I am considering the idea of mailing out applications for absentee ballots from my office centrally, because that avoids that job at the local level, and also we can pay for it. If we were to do that, obviously the sooner the better, because people have to have time not only to get the application, but then they have to send it back, then they have to get the ballot, then they have to send it back. I mean, our process is very, very labor intensive. And so, you know, there's not really a drop dead date, but I would say by mid-June, we better be starting along this path. And right now we have to be able to start implementing the rest of the plan as well. So that's really my own internal timeline is pretty much, we better have this ready to go, ready to mail mid-June at the latest.
Well, I think it was a question from someone that was going to be asked later, but it makes sense now, is that how can the League of Women Voters assist in helping with the increase of absentee voting, assuming that there is an executive order or some way to change that?
That's a great question. I think the biggest problem right now that I see, maybe not the biggest, but a big problem, is poll workers for the polls that we actually will have. Because the last thing we want is what happened in Milwaukee. And we have to have a way to accommodate people both at the polling place and with absentee ballots. We are going to ask the towns to give us a plan. If they want to change or close polling places, they're going to have to let us know. And there will have to be a very large public education piece to all this, something the League tends to be good at. And so that might be something where if we can, you know, get that under control and get the towns to give us a plan. If they're planning to change polling places, it would be helpful to help us with that outreach. And the other thing is, we're going to have a program to try to help recruit poll workers. That's another area that once we get an answer on all this, we can start implementing that. I'm planning to do something they did in Michigan. The Secretary of State in Michigan has an actual website where they paired up people who were unemployed or volunteering. The governor has a website where you can go on there, and I guess there's a lot of individuals on there that might be willing to come and work in the polls, especially because, again, we have federal money that we'd be able to pay them. So I think those are the kinds of programs that I could really use a lot of help with, no matter what happens with the absentee ballots. With absentee ballots, if I decide that I'm going to mail the applications out, that's one job that it takes away from the towns, but there's still a lot of process to make people understand what their rights are, how they manage that whole process. So again, it's a big public education program that's going to be needed.
Okay, I can just see all our League members putting on their thinking caps and trying to figure out what can we do, what can we do? So we'll work on that, I'm sure.
Great, that's great.
In order to stick with the time, I'm going to ask Christine, would you like to go next and just talk a little bit about your perspective on this? Christine Connolly, is it 18th District? Oh, gotta unmute you. You should be unmuted, but we can't hear you, Christine. And I don't know what's making that noise. You're not on mute, so I can't hear you. I'm gonna mute you and then unmute you, okay? Can you hear me?
Unmute yourself for a second.
Unmute. Yeah, there's
Mute
something
yourself
with
for a
me.
second.
All right, I'm
Mute
gonna
yourself for a
unmute me.
second.
I'm muting myself, bye.
That noise.
Christine, can you take your earphones out? Can you use your
Pull it out of the machine.
and pull it out of the machine? I think it is your machine that's causing that.
You gotta participate. You can see what's going on. The mutes and the not mutes.
Well, here she is. She's not on mute.
Her mic's not on.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's not.
Is this gonna work better?
There you are. Okay, good. Good.
Okay. The phone may ring, still at work. So we'll
Okay.
just pretend like there's no noise.
Do you want to wait and let Cindy go next?
Oh no, the phone will ring till way after
Okay,
the end of this
all right.
meeting.
All right, speak up.
It's fun to be an essential worker these days, even though our work is not physical in the law firm. We're here and helping people. So I'm a state rep of the 40th district, which is parts of Groton and Ledyard. And I appreciate the Secretary of the State speaking. I support her efforts to make voting easier. And it's good to see Shannon. It's nice to see you at the Capitol so much, and it's a face we miss over at the Secretary of the State's office. So generally our election laws are handled by GAE committee or Government and Elections Committee, which I'm not a member of. But I am a member of Judiciary Committee, and we often step on the toes of the other committees because that's what Judiciary does. And I still think it's the best committee in the General Assembly. I see Barbara, you're unmuted and moving around. Your head's floating in the blue waters. But one thing that Judiciary Committee has been working on, we don't have an actual bill before we closed for COVID. Some of us were a little concerned about what would happen with voting. In last year, we tried to do absentee ballot for any reason. And in the House, that passed by 3/4 of the members of the House. So Democrats and Republicans signed on to it. In the Senate, though, it failed absentee ballot for any reason. And one of the senators who voted no was unfortunately the senator in the 18th district, my senator. Senator Summers did vote no on that and didn't want to make absentee ballots for any reason the law. So those of us in the Judiciary Committee were kind of working and planning, and it was spearheaded by our vice chair on what can we do if we need to do absentee ballot for any reason. And without 3/4 majority, because we can't control the Senate and we can't control folks who are voting no. So we thought, and we had been talking a lot to ourselves, and I'm sure the Secretary of the State supports, on what we can do to make a statute to mirror the Constitution. So the Constitution is a little more broad in its language, and some of the lawyers were working together and think that if we did a statute that mirrored the Constitution, it would give more broadness for absentee ballot. And we had no idea COVID was coming around the corner, but it did. So I think that's something that we should push, and I support Denise Merrill, and I hope that we will be back in for special session sooner rather than later. And if we can get the governor to do an executive order along those lines to make our statute, which is section 9135, mirror the words in the Constitution, I think it will make it broad enough that anyone with sickness could vote absentee. And I will support and help to get the 51% of a validator bill in the House. And I know I have senators who will support and help, and hopefully we can get the 51% in the Senate, because we can change a statute just with 51%. We don't need 75%. We don't need 2/3. We don't need the people to vote. And then hopefully after COVID, when we're in regular session, folks will realize in the House and the Senate that we should do something more with absentee ballot for any reason and get that constitution changed, and make it a little easier for folks to vote. I've said before that I've been unable to vote due to a busy work schedule, living in district, but having just a very busy day and not getting to the polls. I know many folks who lie on their absentee ballot applications because our laws are so strict that if you want to make sure you can vote, and if you're just not feeling well before COVID, or if you have a busy day, or let's say you're a person with a physical disability and it's just hard to get to the polling place, to physically get there and get in and out of a car and get to your ballot, and you want to be able to vote absentee, that we should make it able to vote absentee. I've heard, since we've had COVID, I think I would rather be at the General Assembly making laws and voting on laws, but that's the times we have. I've seen so much outreach by constituents, and there's a desire. People are engaged that unfortunately have never been engaged before, and it's because they've needed our services. So I had 6 different people contacted me today within the 40th district who needed help with food aid and unemployment. Our constituent services have not seen that kind of outreach. So folks are in need. Folks are confused by unemployment. It's very confusing, the application and what to do each week, and are reaching out. Folks are in need of food aid. Folks are having issues with rent, despite the things that the governor has done to, and again, if folks who know the courts are closed, you actually can't get evicted. But landlords are still calling, and some landlords are a little more forceful than others. And if you're not working and your unemployment action is still pending, you have money maybe for food, and that's it. And you don't have money to pay those extra bills. So folks are reaching out, folks are engaged, and I think folks want to vote. Folks who will want to vote in person, but I think a lot of folks will want to vote to say, okay, I've been a taxpayer, I've been a member of this state, and I've never needed the state. And then all of a sudden COVID happened and I really needed the state. I needed the social services. I'm happy that we have a social service, a safety net, because people have needed that over these last few weeks, and will continue to need it. And I think that folks, hopefully that engagement will continue through August and continue through November, and say, I want to support people who've supported these services, or I did or did not like what happened with this service, and I want to make sure I vote. So I think we will see more voters. I know for my polling place, I often have no line. The only time I had a line was 2008 with Barack Obama, and I vote at the Mary Morrison School, where a lot of our military personnel vote. And with that election, I waited for an hour outside.
Oh.
So in Groton, waited for a good hour outside in 2008. I've not ever had to wait that long again, and we were excited, and it was a fun line to be in. There was a lot of excitement about voting and voting for the president, and but then next presidential, never saw that line again. I don't know if we'll see an hour wait in line, but I don't think it would be safe to have folks be in that line for an hour. I remember we had gotten chairs out of our cars to help some of the elderly in the line who couldn't stand for an hour, and we certainly were not social distancing in that line in 2008. So if we have that line again, it's going to be an issue, and it's going to be an issue on how can folks safely vote. And I do hope that we have that voter engagement again, but a little safer this time, especially if COVID doesn't stays around the fall. So I'm happy to support.
I think I'm pretty sure you talked to the choir here about wanting everybody to get out and vote, and to some extent supporting the absentee ballot initiative. I am confused, so I'm going to assume maybe some other people are confused about what you meant by mirroring, having legislation, that the statute that mirrors the Constitution. Could you explain that a little bit more?
I'd love to, and Denise Merrill knows these words by heart. But in our Constitution, which is Article 6, Section 7, it says that you can vote absentee for a variety of reasons. One of them, of course, is military. The other, it's labeled inhabitants because of sickness, comma, or physical disability, or religion. The good folks in 1963 who wrote Statute 9-135 said, instead of using sickness, said his or her illness, his or her physical disability, and his or her absence from town. Well, it really said his back in 1963, let's be clear. We added the her in. His or her absence from town, from her voting residence during all hours of voting. So his or her absence from town during all hours of voting, his or her illness, that's not in the Constitution. It says absence from city or town or because of sickness. So if we made that statute 9-135, which the General Assembly has the authority to do, the same, saying absence from town or because of sickness, that makes it very broad and allows a lot more folks the ability to get an absentee ballot legally.
Exactly.
Okay, thanks. That helps me. Let's see. Thank you very much, by the way. There's a lot of information there from both of you. And Cindy, where are you, Cindy? I'm trying to find you. Cindy Ladwig.
There we are. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
great. Okay, now we get, thank you.
I'm on my iPhone because the computer is not working with the Zoom camera or whatever. So you're getting me here.
You look terrific.
Okay.
And I know we've had some maybe theoretical people talk, and now we need some nitty gritty.
So, as you remember, Irene, you caught me right at the first conference call with the Secretary of the State's office, having to do with no excuse absentee balloting, as we call it in the town clerk's offices, and what a challenge that will be for all town clerk's offices in Connecticut. We certainly will be prepared. That's what town clerk offices do, but it certainly will be a challenge. 4 years ago for the presidential election, Stonington had 10,375 people vote, which is 76% of registered voters in Stonington, which is amazing and it's wonderful. But the thought is a little overwhelming to realize that it's possible that 10,000 plus people are going to get a ballot instead of going to the poll. And what will that do to our offices, along with our day-to-day operations of land records and vital statistics and trade names and sporting licenses and dog licenses. So that again will be a challenge. And the Secretary of the State's office says that there is money there for us, that they're going to allow us to hire more people. So that's where we're at.
And do you see any, one of the questions, I don't know if you heard all of the other talks, but one of the questions was how can the league be helpful in this process?
Well, yes, and I'm hoping that maybe you guys are going to be the people that are going to come in and help us, administer the absentee ballots. That would be very nice.
Sure. We'll do our best to find people if we can't come in ourselves. Okay, thank you so much. I think that gives everybody that's answered some of the questions that people had sent in. There was a little bit, Christine referred a little bit to one of the questions that Claire Sauer, who I don't think is here, and Bernadette asked, and that was, are all the representatives from this area pro mail-in ballot for the November election? They want to know how our representatives, I think there was one comment about Senator Summers not being in favor. of no excuse mail-in ballots or absentee balloting. But can, I don't know, who, maybe Christine or Denise, do you have a sense, or Christine, Denise, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, I do want to correct one thing that Cindy said. Cindy, you don't need to worry about all people voting by mail. I don't think that's at all desirable, frankly, or possible in Connecticut for the fall. And I don't think that's contemplated by anyone. That's really not no excuse absentee balloting. No excuse absentee balloting means you still have to fall under, you know, you have to get the absentee ballot. And I don't think anyone contemplates that everyone would ever vote absentee. But I do think you're going to see a significant increase no matter what we say one way or the other, because we don't really have a policing system for figuring out if people are saying that they're sick and they're not, or whatever. So anyway, I just wanted to make sure everyone understands. I don't think that's at all contemplated in Connecticut. I know there are states that do total vote by mail. Oregon, Washington, I think there's about almost 10 states now that are doing that. But it takes years to put in place the systems that you would need to do that. And we aren't even close to that. So just rest assured, that is not the case. Now, as far as, what was the other question? Now I'm forgetting.
Who supports the no excuse absentee?
I can tell you, and you know, actually Christine might be even better to answer this, but yes, in the House, we had a lot of support. We did have some Republican support, not as much as I thought we were going to have, but we did have it in the House. In the Senate was a different situation, and it was pretty much, it would have been a party line vote. I think what happened, and maybe Shannon, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you were very involved in this. The Senate changed the bill to eliminate the part about no excuse absentee balloting, because in order to pass the constitutional amendment allowing early voting, which was also important and frankly also needs to be implemented, because having more days of voting is even in some ways even better than more absentee balloting, but both would work together anyway. So in order to pass the constitutional amendment with early voting in it, and that, as you may recall, was to provide, I think it was 3 to 5 days of voting in Connecticut besides Election Day. And we would join, I think it's now 35 states that already have other days besides the Tuesday to vote. And so that's what happened. They took it out, and I don't believe it ever actually got voted on the floor of the Senate. Is that right, Shannon? Are you on the
Actually, it originated in the House, who passed it with a bipartisan crew.
Right.
But it went to the Senate, and they did the narrowing of the topic as a strategy for that. When it went to the Senate, it passed, but it passed with a simple majority. So while it's on the while it's on the track of the constitutional amendment process, it will require another vote of another General Assembly. But I think it's also important to recognize that we're not, what the Secretary is proposing and what Representative Conley has described around a statutory adjustment still works within the framework of having an absentee ballot process that requires an excuse. So it does not create this no excuse dimension that would require a constitutional amendment.
Right.
Okay, thanks. Sally, you have a follow-up question and you're unmuted. Do you want to ask it? Well, maybe you're not unmuted. Can you unmute yourself? Because you're unmuted on my screen. Wait a minute. Can you talk now? No. All right, I'll ask Sally's question just for time issues, if I can find it. Well, Sally wants to know, do league members need special training or authorization to help town clerks with absentee ballots? And should we, well, we can discuss amongst ourselves, should give us advice. Should we consider that as soon as possible? Do we need special training?
if you're asking me, I believe, and Cindy would know better than I believe that the clerk can deputize people to help with absentee ballots. And that's definitely true with registrars. If you're talking about working at the polls, there is an online polling training, poll worker training class, and that's overseen by the registrars. But Cindy, is that correct? I believe that's right.
I think you're right. I mean, I've never had to hire other people to do absentee ballots because it's, you know, we've had enough staff to do that, but I don't see why not.
Yeah.
Okay. Diane Hoffman wants to know, she was told that Senator Looney has to call the no excuse absentee ballot voting for a vote.
Yeah, so because the Senate only passed last year by a majority, a new General Assembly, so that would be the folks voted in after 2018, would have to vote by 51% to change the Constitution. That would have to get voted again by the House and Senate, and then the people would vote in 2020 to change the Constitution. Senator Looney could call.
No, I don't think so either.
2022.
2022, did I get my years
Yeah.
wrong? Yep, 2022.
Right.
Yep.
Because we're in 2020.
Yeah.
The House did vote by 3/4 majority, so that would have put the question on the ballot. But unfortunately, our Senate colleagues did not follow us along. So
And was that no excuse absentee ballot, or was that early voting?
No,
that was
That-
early voting.
that's early voting.
Early
but
voting, not
It
no.
still is not the no excuse absentee balloting.
Right. That's not near being able to go to a referendum.
It's not quite ready, unfortunately. The House had to cut a deal to get the 3/4 of a vote and
For the early voting.
for the early voting.
Right.
And that meant that you could vote absentee early. If, let's say, I remember last time I was talking to a woman, she was extremely pregnant at the last election and thought that she would be able to vote on election day. And it turned out that that baby had another plan. And she was otherwise, about a week before the election, she became no longer extremely pregnant and became a new mother. And getting out and going, taking that infant was on voting day was going to be difficult, but she could have gone to town hall a day early. Clearly didn't think about that a week and a half early. So she, if we had early voting, she could have said, oops, I need to vote early. Or if she was uncomfortably or in the hospital, she could have voted early and then had that baby a little bit later. But we're going to do what we have to do with the Senate and the House, and maybe things will change at the next election.
Thank you. I'm looking at our questions, and there are a lot of questions about both how can we affect our representatives to support mail-in voting. What can we do? I know we worked really hard for the no excuse absent notes for the early voting. We worked really hard to get that passed, and I guess it's going to happen, but not for a while.
Yeah, and even though we're closed because of COVID, most of us, our emails go right to our phone, so you can email. We all have access to email offline. So if you're emailing, your House members and senators all have full access to emails. Our staff has full access to our phone messages offline through their cell phones. So if you email and call, even though we're technically, working from home, so we can still get all of our messages and all of our emails.
I remember I worked for a congressman for a year, and the things that made a big difference were personal letters and phone calls. Do you feel that's still valid rather than just emails, or what do you think?
I have not been able to get letters since we've been closed. There's been some difficulty getting folks in the mailroom to process the letters to the individual representatives and then get those to us. So I would suggest during COVID, a personal email is better, slightly better than a standard email. If they all look the same, sometimes they're easier to overlook. And make sure you put your name and your address. If you're a constituent, those emails I think are looked at often a little bit with better eyes. But right now with COVID, we are having an issue getting the snail mail or the traditional mail is quite slow getting to us.
Right. Okay, here's one probably for Denise and Cindy. How can vulnerable at-home voters be protected from undue influence by family members or caretakers, etc.? With mail-in voting, I assume that question is.
Well, I guess that would be true of any kind of voting when you think about it. And the answer is you can't. People have a right to consult with family members if that's what they wish. And so there's a fine line there. And I know there are, if you're talking about people, for example, in elderly housing, there are federal laws requiring that registrars go in and do what they call supervised absentee balloting in those facilities. But in general, any person can consult with people about who they want to vote for. And if they choose to listen to those family members, there's really not a lot anybody can or frankly should do about that. You know, then you're trying to decide who's capable of making up their minds about who to vote for. I think that's dangerous ground, honestly.
Okay. We have one member who's very much into detail, so I have a few questions from her. And meanwhile, if other people on this meeting want to put a question in chat, we have a couple of questions there too. But one from our other member is, how can Connecticut ensure proper balance between providing adequate signature scrutiny to ensure mail-in ballots are valid while ensuring that no valid ballots are unnecessarily eliminated?
Well, I will just tell you, first of all, no one's proposing changing any process we're already doing. The real question is, how do you manage that if there's a lot more of them? So we already have quite a few checks and balances. Some would argue too many. It's very cumbersome getting an absentee ballot as it is right now. You have to get an application, you fill the application out, you have to mail it back, then they have to mail you a ballot. But all along the way, the clerks are marking you off the list, are guarding those ballots that come in. There's a lot of process around it. And many protections have been put in place over the years, including the fact that if a candidate, for example, frequently candidates mail out the applications, they have to check them out. They have to know exactly, what your name is. If you're a distributor of those applications even, it's all registered. So I think the real question here is not, I know some people have raised this question about whether or not there's integrity to absentee ballots. I don't think anyone's arguing that people shouldn't be able to get an absentee ballot at all. I mean, every state allows absentee ballots. I think it's a question of how you process them and how we're going to manage it if there's a great deal more of them.
Okay. Okay, I don't see any chat, so I'll go on that haven't been addressed. So I'll go on to the next question here is, do you have plans for how to reduce infection rate at in-person polling places as well as to protect the poll workers?
The answer is yes. We have a plan that we're developing as we speak that will be in place for the primary. We will hopefully be able to help towns if they haven't got the protective equipment. We'll be able to purchase it for them in bulk and somehow get that out to everybody. We also are hopefully going to be able to allow towns to change polling places if needed. Normally this is really not a good idea because it creates voter confusion if you move polling places around that are different for the primary than for the general. But in this case, there may be instances where a town has a polling place that's too small to be able to allow the social distancing, for example. But we will do everything we can to support the town. The towns have to come up with the plan. They have to figure out how they're going to make sure these polling places are safe for people. We will certainly augment it, and we we will need to approve those plans, because we don't want to have happen here what happened in Milwaukee, where, for example, they collapsed literally like 80 polling places down to 4 or something like that, anticipating that everyone was going to vote by absentee ballot. Well, actually, the opposite happened. So that's what makes this so tricky, is that we don't really know how many people are going to be out to vote. I mean, frankly, I'm thinking this primary is going to be a low voter turnout. I mean, people see it as kind of already settled. So between that and the fear with COVID virus, I'm afraid probably very few people will vote at all. But that's something we just have to try to guess, because we've never been in this situation before. So all we can do is try to make sure that the polling places are secure and safe. We'll do everything we can to help that happen, and that people that want to get an absentee ballot legitimately under our laws are able to do so.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Terry, I'm trying to unmute you and you have a question. Can you unmute yourself? No. I'd rather have you speak than, oh no. Let's try it again. There you go. Okay, you should be all right. Can you
Okay.
speak? All right.
Well, actually, my original question was, can't we make it easier to vote? It just seems like Connecticut is always so progressive, and we seem to be behind most states on voting as far as early voting and the absentee situation. But I put in the chat that my brother lives in Wisconsin, and I know everybody is discussed with them right now. But surprisingly enough, they approached him to see if he intended to vote, got him the absentee ballot, and then asked him if he wanted to vote again at the other elections this year. And I don't know how they did that, but, or, you know, how you could do that across the state. I assume that they would have to. So I just wondered if Denise knew anything about Wisconsin's normal procedures when they aren't under the Supreme Court's directions.
You mean somehow the Secretary of State's office or the election board or whatever sent people notices and asked them if they were going to vote? Oh.
Asked them if they wanted an absentee ballot. And,
Oh.
and so
Well,
they did approach him.
oh, yeah. Well, I mean, effectively, if we decide to go ahead with my plan to mail an application to every primary voter, that would be kind of the same thing. I'm hoping to avoid a lot of the process that needs to go into that by doing that. That's exactly what we're, but you'd still have to apply under the rules, and we'd have probably a checkbox to say, yes, I would like an absentee ballot. And I just need more clarity from the legislature and or the governor so that we can make sure we're not steering people wrong. We want them to feel confident that they can vote safely. And so that's the dilemma. That's where we are. But I think by mailing applications out to everyone, effectively, we are saying, you know, please vote and reminding them of the primary. And we'll see if that works.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm not sure about Wisconsin's procedures, but it could have been that a candidate reached out to your
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I wondered.
brother. Often the candidates may keep lists of folks who have voted absentee in the past or said they voted absentee, and you could reach out and say, you know, I heard you voted I saw on the list from 2 years ago or last year that you had voted absentee. Do you need an absentee ballot? Do you have your ballot? In Connecticut, if candidates wish to register to hand out applications, they can. Or candidates could, you know, our absentee ballot application is online. You can just print the online thing, and then the person would fill that out, mail that in themselves. But you can print the online ballot, and the voter would do all the paperwork they would normally do without the candidate being involved. But often if someone asks that, a candidate may keep a list and say, did you receive your ballot? Did you mail your ballot in? You know, thank you. And that could have been who reached out to your family member, candidate, or a candidate staff.
Well, is it possible that the league could do that?
Sure. Yeah, there's no reason you couldn't. You know, the application is on our website. There's no reason you couldn't send a postcard at least to people and say, hey, by the way, you can get an application on the website. Yeah. By the way, registrars frequently send applications to graduating high school students. One thing that's been flagged for me is the fact that there are all these students that normally in May, registrars go into the high schools and register the kids who will turn 18 by election day, and none of that can happen this year. So a group of students approached me with that issue the other day, and I think it's a big issue. It's also an issue for college students. We had just put in place a whole process to get college students registered to vote through their normal registration for class process online. We have a whole new system to get everyone registered, and I just don't know how that's going to work this year in a lot of the colleges. So there's another real gap that we're facing.
And the league could share that stuff from the Secretary of State's website on social media. I know the younger people don't use Facebook, but they do use Instagram to share those forms and the website to register to vote to get more folks active.
Great, good, we will. We have one more question. Steve, could you ask the last part of your question? I think your audio is on, so you can ask it because it's a big one and we're just about running out of time. But if you could ask the last part about the electronic.
Yes, is it possible that there could be online voting that would be safeguarded, which would also include some kind of paper trail?
The short answer to that for me would be no. We've been very much opposed to any kind of online voting. There is just no guarantee that it's secure. And I've done a lot of work in this area. I was on the National Voter Security, Election Security Task Force, and the recommendation from everyone is, even in this situation, we just can't guarantee that it wouldn't be hacked in some way. And there's no way that any computer scientist I can find a way to do that. And it's too long to go into, but that's my answer to that question. I don't see us going that direction.
It was a good question to ask, though, because I think that there's confusion about that. Well, we've reached the end of our time. I don't know if any of the speakers want to do a final message, but this has really been interesting and great. I've, as always, learned a lot. Thank you, Sally. And I think we could go on for another hour, but I promised to finish it at 6, and people have dinner or at least a glass of wine to put their feet up with. And want to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for including me.
I just learned a lot just talking to you on the phone, plus this. It was great. Thank you so much. And we're here if we're going to try and be as helpful as we can. And anybody who's not a member, Christine's a member, but anybody who's not a member who would like to join, get us to that 100 membership by during our 100th anniversary of suffrage year. So thank you all again, participants and presenters. It's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right. Fantastic.
Good.